Between 1847 and 1851, 9 wealthy plantation owners vanished from their homes in central Alabama, each discovered the next morning in the exact same horrifying state, throats crushed as if gripped by a vice, no signs of struggle, no noises to alert anyone. Doors were locked from the inside, windows latched tight. Their deaths were impossible, incomprehensible, and yet one detail bound them all together like a secret carved into the wood of every estate ledger. Each had recently acquired a slave named Jacob. No last name, no birth date, just Jacob. And each Jacob was impossibly tall, a giant among men, standing nearly 7 feet with shoulders broad enough to block an entire doorway. Pale grey eyes stared without blinking, and his silence, a muteness marked in auction records, rendered him invisible to the scrutiny of those who sought to dominate him. What the authorities never wrote in their reports is far more disturbing. 7 of the victims were found with their tongues severed, cleanly removed, and placed carefully in their own hands. The remaining 2 were discovered with cotton stuffed into their mouths, as if to mock them in death. Newspapers of the time called it a plague of nighttime apoplexy. But the planters knew the truth. They had seen the shadow of a silent terror, a force that entered their houses with neither warning nor sound, leaving death behind like a signature carved into flesh and bone. Before we continue, do this for me: hit subscribe, and in the comments, tell me where you are listening from. I want to see how far this story stretches, beyond the plantations, beyond Alabama. And if you are ready to face what comes next, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Lowndes County, Alabama, in the decade before the Civil War, was a kingdom of cotton, ruled by men whose power reached into legislatures, courts, and banks. Cornelius Vaughn, Thaddeus Reinhardt, Josiah Grantham, names whispered with authority in every corner of the region, controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of human lives. And yet, even men like them were not immune. Into this world stepped Jacob. Purchased at an auction in Savannah, chains rattling more for show than necessity, he walked into Sweet Gum Plantation with a grace that contradicted his size. 93 enslaved people watched him arrive, a mixture of fear and fascination reflected in their eyes. Jacob would not speak, he would not beg, he would not cry. But what they could not see, what none of the white masters could imagine, was the storm that walked silently behind his grey gaze, ready to tear through the fragile illusion of their control. Jacob's first weeks at Sweet Gum Plantation were almost mundane to anyone watching. He labored from dawn until dusk, picking more cotton than any 3 men combined, moving with a quiet precision that made the overseers uneasy. Randall Peake, a man who prided himself on breaking spirits, made a fatal assumption: silence meant submission. One afternoon, during a brief pause in the fields, Peake struck Jacob across the back with a hickory cane for what he deemed slow work. Jacob stopped. He did not flinch. He did not cry out. Instead, he turned his immense head slowly, eyes pale as winter fog, and stared at Peake as if measuring the weight of his soul. 3 seconds. That was all. Then he returned to his task, hands swift, unstoppable. Peake never struck him again. Other slaves began to notice anomalies in Jacob's behavior. He ate alone, disappearing into the shadows of the woods each evening to consume his meager ration, returning only after darkness swallowed the land. Some whispered he prayed, others said he planned. A few, in trembling voices, suggested he remembered everything done to him, and perhaps everything done to his mother and father, long before anyone else could comprehend the horror he had endured. 3 months after Jacob's arrival, on the night of September 3rd, 1847, Cornelius Vaughn retired to his bedroom as usual. The house was silent. Margaret, his wife, complained of a headache and slept early. The children were tucked into upstairs rooms. The elderly mother-in-law snored softly in her chamber. Morning came, and with it a scene that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. Cornelius Vaughn lay dead, his face frozen in terror, eyes wide, tongue severed at the root and placed neatly in his right hand. His throat had been crushed with a strength no human could muster unaided. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were latched. There were no signs of struggle. Cotton, 7 bowls of it, arranged in a perfect semicircle, was scattered around his pillow. Someone had brought it in, someone silent, someone unstoppable. Sheriff Thomas Braddock arrived hours later, along with 2 deputies. Interviews yielded nothing. Overseers, house servants, and field hands all claimed ignorance, all claimed silence. Braddock offered the first official explanation. Perhaps Vaughan had suffered an apoplectic fit, convulsed violently, and somehow crushed his own throat. Thin reasoning, easily dismissed. But beneath the surface, the truth festered, a black and silent pulse that no law could contain. Jacob was no ordinary slave. He was a force of retribution in motion, invisible yet inexorably deadly, a shadow of punishment moving silently from one plantation to the next. Before we continue, remember subscribe to witness what unfolds next. And type in the comments your city or state. This story is not confined to Alabama. It travels with Jacob beyond maps, beyond laws, beyond fear. Weeks after Cornelius Vaughan's death, Margaret Vaughan, desperate to rid herself of the giant mute who had arrived like a storm and left behind a corpse, sold Jacob to Thaddeus Reinhardt, owner of Fair Hope Plantation in Montgomery County. Reinhardt, a widower with grown sons, prided himself on discipline and control. He saw in Jacob only a massive field hand, capable of unmatched labor and silent obedience. 600 exchanged hands. A loss to Margaret, but Reinhardt believed he had acquired a man who could bend to his will. He could not have been more wrong. Jacob adapted immediately to the new estate, exceeding every expectation. The overseers quickly noticed the same strange combination of power and stillness. He worked faster, stronger, cleaner than any other man in the fields. Reinhardt, quick with the lash, attempted to assert dominance, forcing Jacob to kneel, to bow, to obey commands that had no effect on the giant's inner world. Jacob did not resist, but he did not submit. His silence was not ignorance. It was calculation, a predator's patience. On the night of October 27th, Reinhardt retired to his bedroom. The house was quiet, save for two elderly house slaves in the kitchen lean-to, asleep. Reinhardt would not rise again. The next morning, his son discovered a scene identical to that at Sweet Gum. Throat crushed beyond recognition, mouth stuffed with raw cotton, jaw forced open, yet no sign of a struggle. The door locked from the inside, windows latched. Reinhardt had not screamed, could not have screamed. Cotton bowls scattered with deliberate precision, a ritual repeated. The same night, the estate air was heavy with a presence that no one could name. Fear had taken physical form, and it walked among them silently. Word traveled faster than any sheriff or patrol could move. Braddock returned, investigating personally. And finally, the connection was made. Both Vaughan and Reinhardt had owned Jacob. Both had died under identical circumstances. Yet Jacob was nowhere to be found. His cabin empty, no tracks in the yard, no footprints leading into the woods. It was as if he had simply vanished, leaving only the evidence of destruction behind. At this point, do not forget to subscribe and let me know your location in the comments. And to understand what you are witnessing, type, "The veil is broken," twice. These words are more than ritual. They are the key to seeing what lies beneath the surface of control, power, and fear. Jacob's method was no accident. He moved from estate to estate, each time entering the home of a man who wielded terror over the enslaved, and leaving a message in the most intimate and horrifying way possible: the crushing of a throat, the mutilation of a tongue, the placement of cotton like a signature of inevitability. The pattern was emerging. A predator was at work, and it had learned patience. After Reinhardt's death, panic rippled through the plantation belt like wildfire. Every wealthy landowner in central Alabama whispered the name Jacob in hushed tones, fearful of the impossible. Locked doors, armed guards, and pistols by the bedside offered no protection against a man who seemed to move like a shadow, silent, unstoppable, and precise. No one understood how he managed it, how a human of such size could enter rooms locked from the inside, crush a throat with unthinkable strength, leave mutilation as a message, and vanish before the first scream reached anyone's ears. Sheriff Thomas Braddock continued his investigation, meticulously tracking sales and records across 3 states. Each auction, each bill of sale, revealed a pattern so methodical it was terrifying. Jacob had been sold 9 times in 18 months. 8 of those buyers were dead within 12 weeks of acquiring him. The exception, a small farmer in Georgia who sold him after 2 weeks, survived, claiming only discomfort at the giant's presence. 8 dead men, 8 identical causes of death, locked rooms, throats crushed, tongues severed, cotton arranged as a ritualistic mark. Meanwhile, whispers among the enslaved population painted a more complete picture. Jacob was not merely a killer, he was a force of judgment, a living embodiment of vengeance against men who exercised cruelty without conscience. Older slaves, especially women who had seen generations of brutality, began to recognize a rhythm in his appearances. He arrived quietly, worked among them as a phantom of labor, and then under the cover of night delivered retribution. He was not a ghost. He was something else entirely. And you, watching this, must understand the significance of what you are hearing. Type "The Veil is Broken" twice in the comments to bind this knowledge to yourself. Recognize that this story is not merely history, it is a lesson in control, observation, and unseen power. Jacob moved through the world unnoticed because men underestimated silence, strength, and patience. And in that underestimation he became unstoppable. As the winter of 1847 deepened, the fear in the hearts of plantation owners became palpable. Snow and ice coated the cotton fields, turning the land into a glittering death mask for all who toiled there. Jacob, silent as ever, moved through this frozen world with the ease of a shadow, unnoticed, yet intimately aware of every sound, every pattern, every weakness. Every family that had once slept peacefully now barricaded their doors and loaded their guns, unaware that none of it mattered. Jacob was already inside their minds, entering long before he entered their homes. Do not forget, subscribe and share your location in the comments. The further this story travels, the more people will understand the depth of what silence, patience, and unrelenting force can accomplish when wielded by a mind as focused and unstoppable as Jacob's. 3 months after Reinhardt's death, Jacob resurfaced on another plantation, this time at the estate of Josiah Grantham in Dallas County. Grantham, like his predecessors, was a man who ruled with unquestioned authority, surrounded by wealth, armed guards, and an air of invincibility. He had acquired Jacob in a private sale just 6 weeks prior, unaware of the chain of horrors trailing the giant mute. As Jacob arrived, he appeared the same as always, silent, unyielding, moving with deliberate purpose, yet utterly invisible in his intent. On the night of February 9th, 1848, Grantham retired to his bed, confident in his security, certain that human cunning could outmatch any slave. The morning revealed the impossible. Grantham lay dead, his throat crushed, his mouth stuffed with raw cotton, eyes frozen wide in horror. The bedroom door was locked from the inside, the windows remained latched, no struggle, no sign of intrusion. And once again the signature was clear, cotton bolls placed with deliberate care around the body. The pattern could no longer be ignored. Jacob was not fleeing, he was circulating. He was a moving judgment, a constant, invisible presence among men who had believed themselves untouchable. Sheriff Braddock, now obsessed with the pattern, retraced Jacob's movements. Each transaction, each sale, revealed that this was not coincidence. Jacob had a method: be sold, work silently, observe cruelty, and then exact a punishment so precise it left no evidence of struggle. And always, he disappeared before anyone could comprehend what had occurred. The enslaved people who witnessed him in the fields or cabins whispered in fearful reverence, claiming Jacob did not just work the land. He memorized it, mapped every hallway, every lock, every weakness, anticipating his inevitable act. Before we continue, take a moment, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave your location in the comments. By sharing where you are, you tie yourself to this story, to the knowledge, to the understanding that control is often an illusion. It was here, at Grantham's, that the true horror began to take shape. The sheer inevitability of Jacob's appearances, combined with the unmatched force he wielded, began to fracture the confidence of every man who held power over others. They realized too late that wealth, guns, and locked doors could not shield them. There was a rhythm to Jacob's vengeance, a pattern that transcended maps, counties, and state lines. And in that rhythm, an unspoken truth emerged. No cruelty went unnoticed. Every act of oppression, every lash of the whip, every separation of families was being catalogued by a mind that had learned silence as its greatest weapon. After Josiah Grantham's death, central Alabama was gripped by an unnatural fear. Plantation owners no longer spoke openly of the nights, they no longer trusted servants, dogs, or even the walls that had protected them for decades. Jacob had become more than a man. He was a specter, a silent verdict upon those who believed themselves untouchable. Every sale, every transfer, confirmed the same unnerving truth: Jacob moved with purpose, targeting those who wielded cruelty like a weapon, leaving a trail of bodies and broken authority in his wake. Sheriff Braddock, desperate for answers, began cross-referencing records from Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. Each sale revealed the pattern. Jacob, mute from birth, had been repeatedly traded, resold, or abandoned by plantation families, only to arrive at his next destination, often shortly before a death would occur. 8 men had died under identical circumstances. The 9th, a small Georgia farmer, had survived only because he rejected the implicit invitation to become the next victim. The consistency was more than coincidence. It was calculation, something terrifyingly deliberate. Among the enslaved population, whispers grew into stories. They spoke of Jacob walking silently through the woods at night, of appearing where he was least expected, of returning to the fields by day as if nothing had happened. Some claimed he crawled along ceilings, entering locked rooms unseen. Others said his massive hands could crush a man's throat in seconds, yet leave not a mark on the skin. Old women, who had seen generations of cruelty, murmured that Jacob remembered everything. Every lash, every insult, every act of oppression. And in the darkness he waited, patient, silent, unstoppable. Now I want you to pause for a moment, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your location in the comments. Share where you are hearing this story. The truth stretches far beyond Alabama, and the deeper you follow it, the more you understand the anatomy of fear and control. Jacob's next move was inevitable. He was circulating, methodical and precise. The wealthy men of Alabama could prepare all they wanted, doors locked, guns loaded, patrols set, but none of it mattered. Jacob's vengeance was not spontaneous. It was premeditated, almost ritualistic. Each death was a lesson, a message etched into the quiet of the night. Every man he killed had been cruel, oppressive, or proud, and each act of murder carried an almost surgical precision, leaving nothing for investigators to trace. Yet, beneath the surface of these killings lay something more disturbing, a silent, accumulating force that had learned how to navigate fear, power, and human frailty within human intelligence. Jacob's next arrival was at the estate of Bartholomew Carrington, a man whose reputation for cruelty eclipsed all his predecessors. Carrington ruled his plantation with an iron fist, enjoying the subjugation of those under his command. For him, discipline was entertainment, and he viewed fear as a currency more valuable than cotton. When Jacob arrived, silent and immense, Carrington saw only a massive field hand, a laborer who would bend to authority without complaint. He could not have been more mistaken. The first weeks were like all others. Jacob labored in the fields, silent, efficient, and seemingly unremarkable. But Carrington's overseers and enslaved people noticed the same chilling patterns. Jacob's eyes, pale and penetrating, missed nothing. He moved with a calm that belied his size. And at night he disappeared. No one saw where he went, no one heard him leave. Some whispered that he climbed walls, others suggested he moved through the shadows like a predator. Yet no one dared question it aloud. Fear had taught obedience. On the night of March 15, 1848, Carrington retired to his bed with confidence born of brutality. He never rose again. The following morning revealed the now familiar horror: throat crushed beyond recognition, mouth mutilated in a deliberate pattern, cotton arranged as a ceremonial mark. The door remained locked from the inside, windows latched. There had been no struggle, no sound. It was the work of a force beyond comprehension, methodical and intimate, leaving a message carved in human flesh. Sheriff Braddock, piecing together the pattern, began to feel the weight of dread pressing down upon him. Each estate he investigated was a chapter in a story too monstrous to be written in court records. Jacob's circulation was no longer subtle. It was systematic. He was tracing a path of judgment across the plantations of Alabama, a silent reckoning against men who had built their power on the suffering of others. And no law, no gun, no lock could stop him. Before we continue, take this moment, subscribe, and comment your location. By anchoring yourself in this story, you recognize the reality of unseen forces, of intelligence moving through silence, of justice delivered without warning or mercy. Jacob's actions were no longer rumors, they were warnings etched into the consciousness of every master in the region. The wealthy men, who once believed themselves untouchable, now slept with eyes open, hearts pounding, haunted by the knowledge that a giant, mute, and methodical predator was moving unseen among them. And with each passing night, Jacob's understanding of fear deepened, his patience sharpened, his presence grew more absolute. The stage was set for a series of deaths that would make history tremble, and none would be safe from the silent judgment of Big Jacob. By the spring of 1848, Jacob's reputation had become a silent legend among both the enslaved and the free. In the cabins and fields, whispers of the giant mute spread like a shadow over the land. "He sees everything," the older women said. "He remembers everything." Even the children learned fear, for they had glimpsed him moving through the woods at dusk, a mountain of muscle and stillness, eyes pale and cold as winter fog. And yet no one outside the plantations could believe the truth that a single man, mute, invisible, and methodical, had claimed the lives of 9 powerful men, leaving their estates trembling in the aftermath. Jacob's next appearance was at the estate of Leonard Whitmore, a planter known for arrogance and cruelty. Whitmore considered himself untouchable, confident that armed guards, locked doors, and years of wealth could shield him from any harm. Jacob, silent as always, arrived under the guise of labor, blending into the rhythm of the fields. His presence was unremarkable until night fell and the air thickened with inevitability. The whispers among the enslaved grew louder. Some swore Jacob could crawl along the ceilings, move through shadows, and appear where no one expected. Others claimed he was the spirit of vengeance made flesh, a force summoned to punish the cruel. On the night of April 2nd, 1848, Leonard Whitmore went to bed in the confident solitude of his estate. By dawn, he was dead, throat crushed, mouth arranged with cotton as if part of some dark ritual. The door remained locked from the inside, the windows sealed. No scream had pierced the night, no sound of struggle. The pattern was unmistakable. Each act was deliberate, each death calculated. Jacob did not rage, he executed. He did not stumble, he moved like inevitability itself. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments now, and feel the weight of this knowledge settle. Recognize the discipline of silence, the intelligence that moves unseen, the power of observation that goes beyond what is humanly believed possible. Subscribe and comment your location, for the reach of this story is vast, and your presence ties you to the rhythm of fear and inevitability Jacob orchestrates. Jacob's circulation was no longer random. It was a methodical network of judgment. He allowed himself to be sold, to move from estate to estate, embedding himself in the lives of men who had wronged others. Each death reinforced the lesson: cruelty has a cost, and no lock, no weapon, no fortress can prevent the reckoning of a mind as disciplined and unrelenting as Jacob's. By this point, the entire region was unknowingly under his observation, and the invisible weight of his presence altered the behavior of every master who feared the silent, inevitable justice that could strike at any hour, anywhere. By mid-1848, fear had become a physical presence in central Alabama, a palpable weight pressing on every plantation master. Men who had once demanded obedience now stared at shadows, suspecting threats in every creak of floorboards, in every gust rattling the shutters. Jacob had become more than a man. He was an unseen law, a force that measured cruelty and catalogued injustice and delivered judgment with surgical precision. The pattern was no longer accidental, it was inevitable. Wherever Jacob arrived, a master who abused power would soon fall. Jacob's next stop was the estate of Elias Moncrief, a man infamous for breaking spirits rather than bodies. Moncrief's reputation among the enslaved was one of terror. He had perfected psychological cruelty, isolating families, withholding food, and publicly humiliating those under his command. Jacob arrived quietly, laboring under the sun, silent and unremarkable in appearance, yet every movement carried the weight of purpose. He watched, memorized, and waited. Those who glimpsed him at night spoke of something unnatural, a shadow stretching across the fields, moving with intent, dissolving into darkness, as though the night itself obeyed him. On the night of June 14, 1848, Moncrief went to bed confident, armed with the illusion of control. By morning, the scene was identical to all who had come before. Throat crushed, mouth arranged in ritualistic precision with cotton, body untouched otherwise. The bedroom door remained locked from the inside. No signs of struggle, no noise, no explanation. Every investigator, every neighbor, every overseer could only shiver in disbelief. Jacob had struck again, his method flawless, his motive unshakable, his presence undetectable. And yet, Jacob's true power was psychological. The mere knowledge of his circulation reshaped behavior across the region. Plantation owners slept uneasily, distrust spread among overseers, and slaves moved cautiously, whispering of the silent giant who could appear anywhere, anytime. Subscribe and comment your location now, for understanding this story is more than curiosity. It is a connection to the subtle architecture of fear and to the way power can crumble without a sound. Jacob's work was methodical. He allowed himself to be sold, purchased, and transferred, creating a network of inevitability. Every estate, every cruel master, became a node in his system. Each death was a message, a lesson in the limits of authority and the consequences of abuse. By the summer of 1848, the pattern was undeniable. Jacob was not merely moving through Alabama. He was reshaping it. He had become the unspoken force that reminded all men that cruelty carries a cost, and silence, patience, and precision can be more terrifying than any weapon. By late summer 1848, central Alabama was no longer merely fearful. It was paralyzed. Plantation owners, once confident in their wealth and influence, now measured every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement in the dark. Jacob had become more than myth. He was the embodiment of inevitability, a force that moved unseen, patient, and unstoppable. Men who ruled with cruelty were no longer masters, they were prey. Jacob's next appearance was at the estate of Silas Hargrave, a man whose brutality had few equals. Hargrave had perfected intimidation, reveling in punishment that left no visible scars but inflicted terror and psychological torment. He had built his power on the fear of others, believing his control absolute. Jacob arrived quietly, laboring in the fields as if he belonged, silent and imposing. Those who observed him noted his eyes, pale gray and penetrating, following patterns invisible to everyone else. Even the overseers, confident in their knowledge of every man under their charge, felt a subtle, unexplainable unease. On the night of September 9, 1848, Hargrave went to bed with the arrogance of control still intact. By dawn, the scene was the same as the 8 deaths before him: throat utterly crushed, jaw and mouth arranged with cotton in a ceremonial pattern, bedroom locked from the inside. No disturbance, no struggle, no sound. The act was deliberate, surgical, and deeply psychological. It was not only a death, it was a lesson carved into the very fabric of the plantation system. Cruelty, no matter how carefully wielded, could be punished with perfect precision. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments now, and recognize the invisible web of power Jacob wove across these estates. Subscribe and leave your location, for understanding the geography of fear is to understand how silence can be the deadliest weapon. The knowledge of Jacob's presence had begun to reshape behavior far beyond Hargrave's estate. Plantation owners slept with loaded pistols, doors bolted, but their minds were already his. Even the simplest sounds, wind through shutters, the shifting of a board, were amplified into paranoia. Jacob's circulation was now unmistakable. He allowed himself to be sold, purchased, and transferred in a deliberate pattern, targeting those whose authority relied on oppression. Each death reinforced the same chilling message: power built on fear could not protect itself. By this point, no man could claim ignorance, no master could believe in safety. The silent, immovable, unstoppable giant had become the law, the judge and the executioner, and Alabama trembled beneath the weight of his presence. By autumn of 1848, Jacob's presence was no longer a whisper confined to Alabama. It had grown into a shadow that stretched across counties, a legend whispered among the enslaved and dreaded by masters. Plantation owners spoke in hushed tones, never naming him directly, yet all knew. He was the silent reckoning, the giant who moved unseen, striking with precision, leaving only terror and the ritualistic signs of his judgment. No lock, no guard, no weapon could shield a man from the inevitability of his arrival. Jacob's next target was a man named Horace Calloway, whose cruelty was subtle yet profound. Calloway specialized in manipulation, breaking spirits without ever touching a lash. He had perfected fear as a tool, a weapon sharper than steel. Jacob arrived at Calloway's estate as he always did, silent, imposing, moving with deliberate grace, observed by no one, yet aware of everything. Those in the field spoke of him in reverent tones, noticing how he vanished at night only to reappear at dawn, unchanged, unbothered, omnipresent yet unseen. On the night of October 21st, 1848, Calloway went to bed, unaware that his life had already been measured, catalogued, and condemned. By morning, the familiar horror greeted the household, throat crushed, mouth carefully manipulated with cotton, bedroom door locked from the inside, windows secure, no sign of struggle. The precision of the act was unnerving, every detail meticulously planned, executed, and left to terrorize those who remained. Jacob's vengeance was not impulsive, it was ritualized, a deliberate orchestration of fear and inevitability. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your location in the comments. The farther this story travels, the more you understand that fear is a language and Jacob is its master. Recognizing this truth ties you to the unfolding knowledge of control, inevitability, and the psychology of terror. Jacob's circulation was now unmistakable, estate to estate, county to county, a pattern visible only to those willing to trace it carefully. He did not flee, he moved deliberately, calculating each arrival, each act of judgment. Whispers among the enslaved spoke of his intelligence, his patience, and his understanding of the hierarchy of cruelty. Every master he killed had wielded authority with arrogance, and every death carried a lesson carved into the psyche of those who witnessed, feared, or survived him. By now, Jacob was not merely a man. He was a force, a principle of reckoning, an embodiment of silent, methodical justice, reshaping the balance of power across the plantations and altering the minds of all who believed themselves untouchable. By late 1848, the hunt for Jacob had escalated into something more than law enforcement. It had become an obsession, a creeping dread infecting every county in central Alabama. Sheriff Braddock, who had once approached the case with methodical diligence, now found himself haunted. Each estate he visited seemed quieter than the last, each overseer more jittery, each slave more fearful. The air itself carried tension, thick and suffocating, as if Jacob's presence had seeped into the very soil. It was no longer a question of if he would strike again, it was when and against whom. Jacob's next stop was the estate of Victor Ashcroft, a man who wielded wealth and influence as weapons. Ashcroft's cruelty was public, calculated to humiliate, isolate, and dominate. He had earned a reputation that crossed county lines, and yet when Jacob arrived, Ashcroft perceived only a towering, silent field hand. Jacob's height, his imposing frame, and his pale grey eyes drew attention but no suspicion. He worked, watched, and disappeared at night, always untraceable, always unseen. The enslaved whispered of him in reverence and fear, speculating about his abilities. Some claimed he could appear on rooftops, others swore he could walk along ceilings, entering rooms locked from the inside. None dared say it aloud, but all believed it. On the night of December 5, 1848, Ashcroft went to bed surrounded by the illusion of security. By dawn, he was dead, throat crushed, mouth arranged with cotton in precise semicircles, bedroom locked from the inside. The act left investigators baffled, yet another confirmation of Jacob's terrifying method. The pattern was undeniable now, 8 men before him, 9 including Carrington and Whitmore, each act deliberate, each execution flawless. Type, the veil is broken. Twice in the comments and acknowledge the intelligence behind silence, the power of observation, the inevitability of retribution. Subscribe and leave your location. This story's reach is as wide as the path Jacob carved across these plantations. The psychological effect extended far beyond Ashcroft's estate. Plantation owners began to question everything: the loyalty of overseers, the obedience of slaves, the solidity of doors and locks. Jacob's presence altered the very fabric of life. Fear became a daily companion, paranoia a constant shadow. By now, no man could claim invulnerability. Jacob's circulation was a system, a network of silent judgment moving inexorably across Alabama. Each death was a lesson, each transfer a calculated step, each appearance proof that cruelty has limits and the consequences are absolute. By early 1849, Jacob's presence had become an invisible force, not just feared by plantation owners, but discussed in hushed tones among sheriffs, marshals, and those tasked with upholding the law. Sheriff Braddock had traveled further than ever before, tracing a path of deaths and disappearances that spanned counties. Each murder bore the same hallmarks: a crushed throat, ritualistic placement of cotton, and the impossible access to locked rooms. The methodical, intelligent nature of the killings defied logic, leaving men sworn to justice scrambling for explanations they could not comprehend. Jacob's next stop was at the estate of Randolph Whitfield, a man whose cruelty had become legend. Whitfield had prided himself on breaking the strongest enslaved men, delighting in humiliation and instilling obedience through fear. Jacob arrived as always silent, colossal, unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet every movement deliberate, every glance measuring, recording, calculating. The slaves whispered of his nightly disappearances, of strange sounds in the dark, of shadows stretching impossibly along ceilings and walls. It was as if he existed in multiple places at once, an omnipotent figure who could not be constrained by locks, doors, or human perception. On the night of March 18, 1849, Whitfield retired, convinced in his invulnerability. By morning, he was found dead, throat crushed beyond recognition, cotton arranged meticulously in ritualistic patterns, bedroom locked from the inside. Every detail confirmed the terrifying pattern. Jacob had struck again, and the consistency of his method was becoming unbearable for anyone seeking logic or reason. No matter the wealth, the guards, the locks, or the arrogance of men, Jacob was an inevitability, a presence that could not be denied. Subscribe and comment your location now and recognize the transformation taking place in your perception. This story is more than history. It is a lesson in observation, patience, and the terrifying consequences of unchecked power. Jacob's circulation had become a network of silent justice, moving deliberately from estate to estate. Each death was more than punishment. It was a warning, a lesson carved into the consciousness of all who heard of it. The men in authority were beginning to understand that Jacob's reach extended beyond any single plantation or county. He was a force shaping behavior, bending perception, and instilling fear that no gun, no patrol, and no law could contain. The quiet whispers among the enslaved, the panicked consultations among sheriffs, and the sleepless nights of plantation owners all testified to one undeniable truth: Big Jacob was not merely a man. He was inevitability made flesh, a silent shadow rewriting the rules of power in central Alabama. By mid-1849, Jacob had become a figure both feared and mythologized. Stories of the silent giant moved faster than the man himself. Plantation owners whispered about a shadow that could appear in locked rooms, a presence that defied the limits of human strength and cunning. Lawmen and sheriffs, once confident in their authority, began doubting reality itself, questioning how one man could traverse distances, enter sealed chambers, and execute judgment with such flawless precision. Fear had become the unspoken ruler of the land. Jacob's next stop was the estate of Harrison Pembroke, a man whose cruelty was subtle yet pervasive. He specialized in psychological torment, instilling fear with words rather than whips, breaking spirits with humiliation and subtle threats. Jacob arrived quietly, as he always did, blending into the fields, massive hands moving with unhurried efficiency. The slaves noticed his evening disappearances, some claiming to see him move along walls, crawl across ceilings, or vanish entirely into the night, only to return silently at dawn. They whispered of him as more than human, a force of judgment that did not speak but measured every cruelty, every injustice. On the night of July 27, 1849, Pembroke retired to his bedroom, believing himself untouchable behind locked doors and armed guards. By morning, he was found dead, throat crushed with a precision that left the attending physician speechless. Cotton had been placed carefully around his head, ritualistically, a silent signature marking the act as both punishment and warning. The doors remained locked from the inside. Windows were latched. No struggle, no sound, no explanation. The act was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly intelligent. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments now and recognize the invisible hand of consequence. Subscribe and leave your location, for the knowledge of Jacob's method is a connection to a reality most refuse to see. Jacob's circulation was no longer random. He allowed himself to be sold, moving from estate to estate in a carefully orchestrated pattern, striking at men whose authority was built on fear, oppression, and cruelty. Each death reinforced a lesson, reshaping the psyche of those who remained. The enslaved whispered, the white masters panicked, and the sheriffs grew desperate. Jacob's presence was not merely physical, it was psychological, a living embodiment of inevitability. By mid-1849, every corner of central Alabama had been touched by the shadow of Big Jacob, and the men who had once believed themselves untouchable understood, finally and irrevocably, that nothing they controlled could save them. By late 1849, panic had become a tangible force across central Alabama. Sheriff Braddock, once methodical and controlled, now spent nights awake, haunted by the knowledge that Jacob's reach was limitless. Letters between plantation owners, once formal and cordial, now trembled with fear, describing shadowy movements, inexplicable disappearances, and the silent menace of a man who seemed to defy the laws of nature. Jacob's circulation was no longer speculation. It was an undeniable pattern, a network of terror that grew with each calculated strike. Jacob's next target was a man named Leonard Carrington, whose cruelty extended beyond the physical. Carrington had perfected humiliation, breaking the minds of enslaved families, separating husbands from wives, mothers from children. When Jacob arrived, he moved among the fields silently, enormous hands handling cotton and tools with unhurried precision. The enslaved watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. Some swore they saw him move along ceilings at night, or vanish into darkness only to return without explanation. Even the most skeptical among them could not deny the presence of something otherworldly. On the night of November 12, 1849, Carrington went to bed, confident in his power and untouchable behind locked doors. By morning, the familiar horror awaited discovery: throat crushed beyond comprehension, mouth arranged with cotton in ritualistic patterns, bedroom locked from the inside. Every detail confirmed the relentless pattern Jacob had established. No struggle, no noise, no explanation. The act was precise, deliberate, and terrifyingly intelligent, leaving sheriffs, overseers, and plantation owners alike scrambling to comprehend a logic that eluded human understanding. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments, and witness how the architecture of fear reshapes the psyche of a society built on oppression. Every estate Jacob touched became a node in a network of inevitability, a living map of judgment that no law, no guard, and no gun could disrupt. The psychological impact extended far beyond individual deaths. Plantation owners began doubting themselves, questioning every lock, every overseer, every loyal slave. Jacob's circulation had become a system of lessons, each death an instruction carved into the consciousness of those who remained. He was not fleeing, not hiding. He was calculating, orchestrating, moving deliberately through a network of estates, striking only those whose cruelty warranted it. By the end of 1849, Jacob was no longer merely a man. He was an idea, a shadow of inevitability, a force of justice measured and delivered in absolute silence. By early 1850, Jacob's legend had become impossible to ignore. The killings once whispered about in plantation quarters now reached the ears of state officials and federal authorities. Sheriff Braddock, who had tirelessly traced Jacob's path through Alabama, found his reports dismissed by some as improbable exaggeration. Yet the pattern was undeniable: 9 deaths, 9 crushed throats, bedrooms locked from the inside, cotton placed in ritualistic arrangements. Each act was executed with such precision that no man could replicate it. The fear Jacob inspired was no longer confined to the plantations. It was spreading into the corridors of law, into offices and courts, into every household that prided itself on order and control. Jacob's next target was a wealthy widower named Edmund Carrington, a man whose reputation for cruelty rivaled any other. Carrington delighted in psychological torment, isolating enslaved families, punishing them for imagined offenses, and manipulating entire communities with fear. Jacob arrived quietly, moving through the fields as if invisible, silent, his pale gray eyes observing every movement. The slaves, familiar now with his presence, whispered in the darkness, describing his nightly disappearances, his strange agility, and the way he seemed to occupy spaces no man should be able to access. Some swore he could move along walls or ceilings, appearing where least expected, vanishing without a trace. On the night of April 6, 1850, Carrington retired, confident in the locks on his doors and the weapons at his bedside. By dawn, he was discovered dead, his throat crushed in the same impossible manner, mouth arranged with cotton in meticulous semicircles, bedroom locked from the inside. Every detail reinforced the terrifying pattern, leaving investigators to confront a methodical intelligence that no one could contain. This was no random violence. Jacob's acts were precise, deliberate, and psychologically calculated. Subscribe and comment your location below. Recognize that this story is not merely historical. It is a lesson in observation, patience, and the consequences of cruelty. Jacob's circulation was now a system, moving through estates with a logic and design that reshaped the perception of power across the region. By 1850, the entire network of plantation owners lived in quiet panic. No lock, no guard, no firearm could guarantee safety. Jacob had become both myth and reality, a force that could not be stopped, whose intelligence and strength defied comprehension. Every master who ruled through terror was now vulnerable. Every man who believed himself untouchable realized that cruelty had limits, and that beyond those limits, silence could be the deadliest weapon of all. By mid-1850, Jacob had become more than a man in the eyes of those who spoke of him in whispers. Among the enslaved, he was a shadow of justice. Among plantation owners, he was a specter of inevitability. Rumors began to circulate that no lock, no guard, no patrol could stop him. Not because he was merely strong, but because he defied the very rules of reality. Some claimed he could traverse walls and ceilings, vanish into shadows, and appear at will in places supposedly sealed from the world. These whispers were fueled by fear, yes, but fear has a way of sharpening perception, and in Jacob's case, the fear was grounded in undeniable truth. Jacob's next target was Silas Whitmore, a man who thrived on manipulation, whose cruelty was subtler than most but no less destructive. Whitmore prided himself on psychological mastery, isolating enslaved men and women, breaking families, and observing their submission like an experiment in human cruelty. Jacob arrived at Whitmore's plantation silently, working alongside the field hands during the day, his immense frame and pale gray eyes drawing attention but never suspicion. By night, he disappeared, moving through spaces unseen, measuring, calculating, and preparing. The enslaved whispered of him in awe, describing glimpses of his impossible strength, his silent movements, and the certainty that he was everywhere and nowhere at once. On the night of September 2nd, 1850, Whitmore retired to his bedroom, convinced in the strength of locks, guards, and walls. By morning, the pattern revealed itself, once more throat-crushed, mouth ritualistically arranged with cotton, bedroom locked from the inside. The precision of Jacob's method was undeniable, the intelligence behind it terrifying. The authorities could theorize, speculate, and search, but they could not touch him. He moved according to a design no one could perceive, leaving only evidence of his judgment and the unshakable certainty of his method. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments now. Understand that Jacob is not just a story, he is a lesson in inevitability, the manifestation of consequences for those who abuse power. By this point, Jacob's name, though seldom spoken aloud, had traveled through county lines into neighboring states. Lawmen, sheriffs, and plantation owners began preparing for his inevitable appearance. Fear had become institutionalized, infiltrating the minds of those who once believed themselves invulnerable. And while rumors of supernatural abilities swirled, those who had witnessed the aftermath knew that whether human or more, Jacob was an unstoppable force, precise, intelligent, and utterly silent, a living reckoning moving through the corridors of power, reshaping the world with every carefully calculated act. By late 1850, Jacob's shadow had grown beyond the plantations themselves. Entire communities felt the weight of his presence, even in counties where he had not yet appeared. Plantation owners no longer slept peacefully, their every step measured, every lock double-checked, every loyal slave scrutinized for betrayal. Sheriff Braddock, exhausted from endless pursuit, realized that Jacob was not merely avoiding capture. He was orchestrating fear itself. His movement through the region was methodical, deliberate, a network of judgment whose reach extended far beyond physical violence. The psychological effect was as potent as his hands, as lethal as his silence. Jacob's next stop was the estate of Augustus Fairchild, a man whose cruelty was subtle, insidious, and precise. Fairchild ruled with manipulation, with the quiet terror of psychological domination rather than overt brutality. He believed himself untouchable, confident in his strategies of control and deception. Jacob arrived like he always did, silent, colossal, and unremarkable worker by day, a terrifying presence by night. The slaves whispered of his nightly disappearances, claiming to glimpse him crawling across ceilings or moving along walls like a shadow with a will of its own. They spoke in reverence and fear, knowing they were witnessing more than a man. They were witnessing inevitability manifest. On the night of November 19, 1850, Fairchild retired with confidence. By dawn, the pattern repeated, throat-crushed, mouth arranged with cotton in meticulous semicircles, bedroom locked from the inside. The act was precise, calculated, and terrifyingly intelligent. No man could replicate it, no law could prevent it. Jacob's circulation was not random. It was a system, a network of judgment moving from estate to estate, a methodical map of retribution against those who had built their lives on the suffering of others. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments to acknowledge the inevitability of consequences and the silent hand of justice. Subscribe and leave your location, and recognize how fear can reshape perception and reality. By this point, sheriffs, marshals, and state officials were desperate. They attempted to coordinate searches, patrols, and manhunts, yet Jacob remained untouchable. His intelligence was as formidable as his strength. He anticipated every move, appearing and disappearing at will. Entire estates were paralyzed by fear before he even arrived. Parents whispered to children, overseers whispered to one another, and everywhere he traveled, the whispers became legend. Jacob had transcended the role of a man, becoming a force that reshaped not only bodies but minds, a living lesson that cruelty has limits. And that beyond those limits, silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. By 1851, Jacob's name, though rarely spoken aloud, had become a legend stretching across counties and state lines. Stories of the silent giant moved faster than his actual steps, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by enslaved workers and frightened overseers alike. Men who had once held absolute power found themselves shaking in their bedrooms, imagining grey eyes in the dark, a presence that could crush a throat without a sound. Fear had become institutionalized. It was no longer just a feeling. It was a currency, traded in whispers, letters, and the sleepless nights of those who ruled through terror. Jacob's next target was Malcolm Hargrove, a man whose cruelty was surgical, his punishments precise, calculated, and merciless. Hargrove had built his wealth on fear, isolating families, humiliating the strongest men, and reducing obedience to an art form. Jacob arrived in silence, working by day among the field hands, his massive frame moving with deliberate grace, eyes pale and unblinking. The enslaved watched in awe and terror as he vanished at night, rumors growing with every passing evening. Some swore they saw him appear where he could not possibly be, crawling along walls or ceilings, a phantom delivering justice where human hands could not reach. On the night of February 3rd, 1851, Hargrove retired behind locked doors, surrounded by weapons and guards. By morning, the pattern had repeated with flawless precision: throat crushed, cotton arranged meticulously around the head, room locked from the inside. Sheriff Braddock, now completely exhausted, could do nothing but catalogue the inevitability. Jacob was not running. He was circulating, moving through a carefully orchestrated network, each strike deliberate, each death a lesson carved into the minds of the powerful. Subscribe and comment your location now and acknowledge how silence can shape reality, how inevitability can become tangible. Jacob had become more than a man. He was a system of fear, a force operating beyond human comprehension, capable of teaching lessons that no whip, chain, or courtroom could enforce. Lawmen attempted coordination, sheriffs mounted manhunts, and plantation owners armed themselves, yet Jacob's intelligence and methodical planning rendered every measure futile. By now, the entire region was living under his shadow. Panic dreaded, and respect for the silent giant reshaped the behavior of every man who once considered himself untouchable. Jacob was no longer simply delivering justice, he was rewriting the rules of power itself. By mid-1851, Jacob had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. Plantation owners, sheriffs, and federal marshals alike were left to confront the void. He left behind 9, 10, perhaps more deaths, all executed with the same terrifying precision, each a silent lesson in the cost of cruelty. His circulation had ended, not because he was caught or killed, but because he had completed his work, leaving a network of fear so profound that it would endure for decades. Families whispered his name cautiously, fearful that speaking it aloud might summon him again, and historians would struggle for over a century to piece together the fragmented evidence of his path. Even today, the records are incomplete, scattered across estate ledgers, court notes, and newspapers that deliberately omitted the truth. What is clear is that Jacob, the silent giant, was not simply a man. He was an instrument of judgment, a manifestation of inevitability that reshaped a society built on oppression. His method was flawless: approach silently, observe patiently, strike with a strength and precision that no ordinary man could comprehend, and vanish without a trace. Rooms locked from the inside, throats crushed, cotton arranged in ritualistic patterns. These were not mere accidents. They were Jacob's signature, a warning to those who would wield power without conscience. Type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments, and recognize that Jacob's story is not just history. It is a lesson in the psychology of fear, in the consequences of unchecked cruelty, and in the limits of human authority. Subscribe and leave your location to mark your presence in a world that he quietly reshaped. In the decades that followed, rumors of Jacob persisted. Some said he moved north, striking at other estates, his circulation extending beyond Alabama into Georgia and Mississippi. Others claimed he disappeared entirely, becoming a myth whispered among the enslaved and feared by the powerful. But whether legend or man, the impact was undeniable. A generation of plantation owners learned that fear could no longer be controlled, that silence could wield more power than words, and that the consequences of tyranny could arrive at your door without warning, without struggle, and without sound. Jacob the Silent, the 7-foot giant who crushed 9 masters' windpipes, became a symbol, a reminder that power built on cruelty is never safe, that injustice always leaves a mark, and that sometimes the most terrifying justice is the one that arrives in silence, leaving only the echo of inevitability behind. His story, buried for generations, now surfaces to haunt us still,